Hi, I'm the Lament butterfly, also known as Asenath Waite, and welcome to my channel. After filming the unboxing of my Hellbound Part 9 bust by Josh Palmer of Shallow Grave FX, I fully intended to do a deep dive into Jason Goes to Hell, The Final Friday. However, in preparing the script for that video, and yes, I desperately need scripts for my Friday the 13th videos, or else I'm liable to go off onto vaguely related tangents for several hours straight, and probably boring y'all even worse thereby than I already do. I realized that much of my analysis and criticism would not make much sense without me first explaining my thoughts regarding the mystery enshrouded figure of Elias Voorhees. So, here goes. A deep dive into the character of Elias Voorhees. Almost nothing about Jason Voorhees' father can be gleaned from the Friday the 13th films. I became fascinated with the enigmatic and invisible character after reading the novelisation of Friday the 13th Part 6, Jason Lives, which was based upon an earlier version of Tom McLaughlin's brilliant script, one in which Elias Voorhees appeared in the flesh. Based upon my interpretation of the little information about him that we are given therein, though, I formed a very specific image of the character, and the nature of the man from whose seed the cat-blood killer was born. Later media, particularly the comics Jason vs. Leatherface and Pamela's Tale, as well as the video game, state that Elias was a drunk who was physically and mentally abusive toward both his much younger wife and her son, and that Pamela killed him in order to escape the abuse. These sources also make clear that Elias was not Jason's biological father. In fact, in these, Jason was the product of rape by a stranger, and Elias stepped in to marry 16-year-old Pamela so that she would not be shamed and shunned by society for being an unwed mother in the mid-1940s. However, the implication is that Elias Voorhees did this not out of kindness, but rather to give himself power over a vulnerable Pamela and her as yet unborn child. The abuse began almost immediately after the two were married, and Jason's deformities, being a result of Elias beating Pamela, is presented as a strong possibility. Interesting material. However, for the most part, even though I have loved the comic books associated with the Friday the 13th franchise, even the weird ones like Jason vs. Jason X or Freddy vs. Jason vs. Ash, which were really fun, I don't agree with this. Pamela's Tale is the sole exception to my love of these comics, as it completely goes against how I had viewed the primary characters of the venerable slasher franchise for some 20 years at the time. First off, Jason is not Michael Myers. He was not a profoundly disturbed child who wound up possessed by the murderous spirit of an ancient Celt named Enda as a result of a bunch of factors that I'll detail should I ever do a Halloween video. In fact, I actually believe Pamela when she describes her son as a sweet, innocent boy. As a result of the social isolation in which he was raised, taking Ginny's description thereof as fact, and his physical condition, no doubt Jason was an odd child, very likely either unable or unwilling to speak, which is confirmed in some of the novelizations. But that does not mean that he was the vicious, animal-like, gibbering little creep presented in Pamela's Tale. Additionally, the fact that Jason has never harmed an animal except for food back when he was more human/more alive speaks volumes about his character. The survival of Muffin in Part 2, Gordon in Part 4, and Toby in Part 8, who didn't even get kicked thanks to Kane Hodder, all serve as proof thereof. And in the 2009 remake, we even see Jason carefully avoiding stepping upon any of the rats swarming around his feet. Jason was not born a monster, and neither did Pamela make him into one prior to his tragic death. Furthermore, I outright refuse to believe that Pamela was a killer prior to the tragic death of her son. The violent, borderline psychotic woman portrayed in Pamela's tale never would have been hired on at a posh summer camp like Camp Crystal Lake, especially not as a single mother with a deformed child in an era when she would have been judged harshly for both of these facets of her heartbreaking situation. Obviously, I have read material that makes both mother and child out to be monsters, even before Jason drowned, and I simply am unconvinced. It does not fit with Jenny's analysis in part 2, and, more importantly, it does not fit with the Pamela who we met in the 1980 original. Yes, she was able to play at sanity during brief interactions, but even as a small child, I recall feeling like something about her was off. I don't recall being surprised that she was the killer, so much as I was horrified and heartbroken to the point of weeping over the fate of her and her son, what had driven her to kill. As an adult watching the original Friday the 13th, it seems far too obvious, at least to me, that this was an incredibly strong woman who was broken by loss, not a warped murderess with a long trail of bodies in her wake even before her son died. Hashtag not my Pamela. Therefore, if I'm going to discard Pamela's tale in my assessment of Pamela and Jason, it would not be very logical of me to base my analysis of Elias Voorhees thereupon, now would it? Clearly, the comic was written to depict the entire Voorhees family as violent and likely psychotic long before death struck its core. To me, this makes the exact same mistake that Rob Zombie did in his Halloween remake films. Michael Myers is far less scary when he's the product of an abusive home and when he's a strikingly large, intimidating man. The true terror of the 1978 original lies in the fact that 6-year-old Michael had no readily discernible motive to kill his sister. And upon his escape from Smith's Grove at age 21, he was a perfectly ordinary-looking man of average height and build, the sort of fellow who would not draw a second glance if not for the mask. That is why his brief unmasking in that film is so significant. Michael could have been any man. The shape of fear is any man. Similarly, Friday the 13th is most effective when we are presented with an ordinary woman whose life is touched by tragedy, first in the form of her son's disability, then being abandoned by the child's father, and finally, in that awful, wholly preventable premature death by drowning. This would be enough to break anyone. Pamela's reaction is extreme and horrifying, but it's believable. It's human. Transforming pain into rage and the desire for revenge are very common reactions to tragedy and loss. Basically, if Pamela is not a representation of any mother in her circumstances, then the warnings of the film, particularly those regarding responsibility, are lost. Plus, if Pamela killed Elias while Jason was still a child, then how could he have shown up in part 6? Well, I suppose that his son could have taken after him in the inability to stay dead, too, but as fun as that theory is to consider, I've not seen any canon evidence in support thereof, and I'm not terribly fond of it. Whilst Jason's resurrections from death could very well have something to do with his father's blood, I believe that there's far more to his sort of immortality than that. Factors like Pamela's emotional state and the so-called death curse upon Crystal Lake that's probably very real. Anyway, obviously I am not presenting an analysis of Elias Voorhees, the brutal drunk killed by his wife in self-defense. Instead, I would like to introduce you all to a very intriguing man who is much more than initially meets the eye. Calling Elias a good man would be a stretch. After all, he abandoned his teenage wife, leaving her all by herself to raise a child with physical deformities that likely would have caused significant and probably expensive health issues requiring medical treatment intervention. everything that I've read seems to indicate that Elias was out of their lives at some point while Jason was still in his infancy. However, the fact that Pamela and later Jason both got buried in the cemetery with headstones to mark their graves, as opposed to just being tossed into a pauper's grave or even more likely cremated, as would be expected in their situation, to me that demonstrates that someone was there to claim the bodies, to pay for the 2 plots in the cemetery, and to pay to have their headstones carved. Further, as Sheriff Garris told Tommy Jarvis in Chapter 2, when the young man asked why Jason hadn't been cremated, some a-hole sent a lot of money to give Jason and his mother a decent burial. Logically, this would have to have been Jason's father, and the Part 6 novelization goes on to confirm this in the very last chapter. This implies that Elias retained some interest in the family that he discarded so many years before. The nature of that interest, though, is very interesting to consider, especially what might have motivated Elias to provide in death for the family that he had abandoned in life. It seems unlikely that it was a sense of responsibility that drove him, as that ought to have been far stronger when they were alive to benefit therefrom, at least in theory. On the surface, guilt would seem to be the most likely motivation, as he had left Pamela and Jason to fend for themselves in a world that was hostile to those in their circumstances. Perhaps Pamela would not have had to take the job as camp cook to support herself and her child had her husband remained in the picture. If she hadn't taken that job, Jason would not have drowned, and Pamela would not have been driven by her pain, loss, and despair to murder, which led directly to her own violent death as well. Yes, just by leaving, Elias himself might very well be one of the direct root causes of all of the mayhem and murder surrounding Crystal Lake. However, once I met Elias at the end of the book, I developed doubts regarding his ability to feel guilt. Instead of understanding him, I was left with more questions and an undying fascination with the mysterious Mr. Voorhees. One thing that the novelization does very well is to build Elias into a rather frightening figure on his own, long before we meet him, mostly through the cemetery caretaker Martin's palpable feel of the man, paying him to watch over the Voorhees graves. At times, Martin even seems to blame his alcoholism upon his association with the man paying him. Upon finding that Jason's grave had been dug up in Chapter 4, one of Martin's first and worst thoughts as he stared down at the gaping grave with dread was, I know he's going to blame me for this. Martin feared losing his job, of course, as that was how he could afford the alcohol upon which he's so dependent. But even more than that, he was afraid of what would happen when he found out that he is the mysterious benefactor. Clearly, losing his job and ability to pay for his alcohol was not the only reason why he feared that man's reaction to the desecration of Jason's grave. Additionally, and this is one of my absolute favorite parts, in describing just how different and unusual Jason was, in particular how quiet and intense he always had been, the novelization points out in that same chapter that Pamela had always taken it for granted that he took after his father. As curiosity-invoking as this is, though, nothing could have prepared me completely for the uncanny figure who we meet at the very end of the book. I really wish that we had gotten those scenes in the film, even though we would have lost Martin's fitting and highly entertaining demise at Jason's hand by a whiskey bottle had that version of the script been used. The tall man in the dark suit stood motionless, silently staring down at the old caretaker. Martin squirmed beneath the directness of his gaze. Nice to see you again, Mr. Voorhees, he said, bobbing his head, avoiding the man's eyes. Haven't seen you in Forest Green in quite some time. The thin, pale face was framed by long, dark red hair heavily streaked with gray. It showed not a flicker of expression. The features were fine and chiseled, deeply etched. The mouth was thin and cruel, but the eyes, don't look at them eyes, Martin thought. No matter what you do. Hey, I've been taking real good care of your wife and son's grave, said Martin, his voice trembling slightly. Go look. You'll be real pleased. Those eyes were like a snake's eyes, cold, feral, ancient. They made Martin think of mausoleums and crypts shrouded with cobwebs and covered with the dust of centuries. They made him think of beasts snarling and snapping at each other, teeth rending flesh and crunching bone. They made him feel as if 1,000 worms were writhing underneath his skin. After paying Martin, the caretaker flees to his shack in order to escape his visitor's unsettling presence, and Elias goes to visit his son's grave. Voorhees walked slowly between the rows of headstones with a stately, measured tread, almost gliding, like a dark, predatory jungle cat. He stopped before the pair of tombstones marking the graves of his wife and son. He stared for a long moment at the simple inscriptions, then his gaze slowly traveled downward to stare at his son's grave. The burning eyes narrowed slightly as they bored intently into the mound of earth. He leaned closer, and his eyes grew wider. His pupils dilated. It seemed as if he was looking right down into the earth, his gaze penetrating the soil like X-rays, seeing the coffin of his son and the strange, broken body that it held now. The corpse of Alan Hawes. Slowly, Jason's father straightened and turned to look after the old caretaker. Inside his shack, Martin upended the bottle of wild turkey and drank deeply, feeling the fire of the whiskey burn his throat, unable to stop shaking. He suddenly felt cold, as if someone had walked over his grave. He couldn't stop shivering. He sank down onto the floor in the corner of his little shack, hugging the whiskey bottle to him with both arms, trembling like a leaf and saying over and over, I swear I didn't, Mr. Voorhees, I didn't know, I swear. Voorhees turned away, his eyes scanning the horizon, searching. His gaze traveled in the direction of the lake, several miles away, not visible from the cemetery. And now, the descriptions of Jason as his father's son, as seen since the Part 2 novelization, make perfect sense, as does the reason why he, of all those who had died at Camp Crystal Lake, was brought back from death to serve as the avenging guardian of that cursed land. That Jason's father almost immediately knew not only that his son was not in his grave, but that he was trapped beneath the waters of Crystal Lake once more, implies that Elias possesses senses beyond those of a normal man. Although we are never told why or how, that Elias is an extraordinary being is an undeniable fact. Even though he is polite in his interactions with Martin, the poor old man is outright terrified of Elias, and that fear goes far deeper than job security. Elias is, simply put, eerie. The description of him from Martin's perspective is outright haunting, and then we see his ability to sense that his son is in the lake as opposed to in his grave. To me, this is the strongest indication that Elias is, in fact, the biological father of Jason, despite all of the sources that state that he was just the boy's stepfather. Lastly, I feel that I would be remiss if I failed to bring up the fan film Friday the 13th Vengeance. In this direct sequel to Jason Lives, we get to meet Elias Voorhees in the flesh. Seeing the marvelous and talented C.J. Graham essentially playing his own father is absolutely delightful, as is seeing the late Steve Dash as the corrupt Sheriff Rialotti. I'll never be comfortable with the inclusion of Evil Dead lore in Friday the 13th, despite my adoration of Sam Raimi's films, some aspects of Part 9, and of course the Freddy vs. Jason vs. Ash comics, because I view Jason as being so much more than some sort of super deadite. To me, he is, simply put, the personification of nature, death, and an ancient curse of vengeance. However, that is neither here nor there. We're talking about Elias Voorhees now. I really liked how Jason Brooks' story put so much focus upon the arcane darkness within Elias, even though I did not like seeing Pamela's first 2 murders ascribed to him, or the inclusion of the Necronomicon Ex Mortis. However, despite my complaints, the vision of the Camp Blood Killer's father presented therein fits almost perfectly with how I have imagined him since I first read the novelization. As I don't want to spoil any more of the fan film in case y'all haven't seen it, and I really recommend that you do. It's a lot of fun, and it has Darcy the Male Ghoul from Joe Bob Briggs' Last Drive-In. I'll end my bit about it here. I really cannot express, though, how much I loved seeing Mr. Graham and Mr. Dash in a Friday the 13th film together, and their performances are, at least for me, the highlights of the film. Finally getting to see the eternally spooky and mysterious Mr. Voorhees on screen, especially played by C.J. Graham himself, who was so perfect as Jason back in Part 6, was just pure awesome sausageness. I do still have so many questions about Elias Voorhees, ones for which there probably never will be answers. It seems evident that Elias was older, probably a pretty good bit so, than his teenage bride, but just how much older was he? That he's old enough to have served in World War II seems likely, and if he did, how did that experience affect him? Also, the indications that we get from Sheriff Garris and Martin seem to imply that Elias is a wealthy man, and the Voorhees house in Part 9 was a mansion. I cannot help but wonder about the source of Elias's money. Was it inherited or earned? And if it was it earned, shall we say, ethically? Of course, there's always the burning question of when Elias abandoned his wife and son, along with why. If Jason was so like him, even as a child, then his son's strangeness hardly seems like a reason to leave. Also, as much as I hate to bring up the lore-breaking Jason Goes to Hell, did Elias have a second family, either before or after he fathered Jason? Oh, big thing. For the body-hopping demon curse, blood curse thing in Jason Goes to Hell to make any sense, Elias has to have been Jason's biological father. So there. Even the Friday the 13th film that broke my poor little mind when I tried to make its lore fit with the precedent set by the others proves my theory that Elias is Jason's father and not just his stepfather. So, in summary, Elias Voorhees is an absolutely fascinating and more than slightly unnerving character. Different media have presented him in impossibly contradictory manners, but to me, the phrase that defines him is Pamela's assertion that Jason is his father's son. And despite some evidence to the contrary, it could not be more obvious to me that the eerie man with burning eyes and inhuman senses who we finally meet at the end of the Part 6 novelization is Jason's father by blood. So, if you made it all the way to the end of this somewhat weird, rambling video essay and enjoyed getting to know Elias Voorhees and my interpretations of this mysterious character, please comment, like, and subscribe for more. I really, really do love reading people's comments, especially those presenting alternate theories and viewpoints. If it's not too obvious, I quite enjoy discussing Friday the 13th. So, thanks for watching. Love you guys. Keep it brutal, always. And thank you.